Thanks for joining me. Today's episode comes from a place of humility. Um, I would say a place of discomfort. I'm going to talk about something that challenged one of my long-held beliefs. And we've talked about the biases that all of us have, one of them being confirmation bias, and how in today's society, especially confirmation bias is running rampant. We want to continue to underscore what we believe in, because being challenged on what we believe in and finding out that we were wrong is typically not a pleasant experience for those exiles in us, those wounded places that are so afraid of being wrong, because it can mean many things, that we're a failure, that we're not worthy, that we're defective, so many money scripts. So it's with that I approach this topic. For most of my life, I thought I knew exactly what socialism meant. Like a lot of Americans, I believed it was a single system, one where the government owns everything, makes all the decisions, and crushes individual freedom. But as I've learned, and I think you have to be living under a rock a little bit, or just choosing not to consume news media, which is maybe a choice I need to consider more. Socialism has really been in the news. And I did a dive. I don't know if I've done a podcast on this before, but I certainly have written columns on it. I've given interviews on public broadcasting regarding socialism. And the fact that a lot of people don't know what they're saying when they say socialism or capitalism, and I still stand by that. We don't. The problem was I was one of those that didn't know what I was truly saying. So in some research that I've done recently, I've learned that my definition of socialism, where the government owns everything, makes all the decisions, crushes individual freedoms, is one version of what's called socialism. And I've discovered there are many versions of socialism, and I've boiled those down to 4 very different systems that all get labeled with the same word. And it's understanding those differences that really is changing the way I think about socialism and fairness and emotional well-being. So this episode's about rethinking what we've been taught. And that's very much a part of financial therapy, isn't it? Because we get locked in on money scripts and emotionally really cling to those. And they can cause us a lot of problem in adulthood. And part of financial therapy is understanding how letting go of old beliefs can be both unsettling and freeing. So let's take a look at what I call the 4 socialisms. When I first heard that the new mayor of New York identified himself as a democratic socialist, I'll admit my gut reaction wasn't exactly open-minded curiosity. It was kind of like, here we go again, but kind of a new again, because we've never had a socialist elected mayor of a national or a large U.S. city. So socialism triggered a very specific response in me. I view myself as a capitalist. And so the response I get by socialism is shaped by decades of Cold War conditioning. I grew up hearing that socialism was bad, even evil. It meant bread lines, empty shells, the end of personal freedom. Capitalism, on the other hand, was good, synonymous with hard work, opportunity, liberty, the chance to accumulate wealth and financial independence. So those two versions of capitalism and socialism are pretty simple. And simplicity can be very comforting. I come from being a very black and white thinker. I've spent a lot of money trying to think more in the gray. But unfortunately, this black and white version of socialism and capitalism was, I found out, incomplete. And this is really on people's minds. I mean, recently an NBC News poll showed something pretty remarkable, that negative views of socialism have declined recently, and positive views of capitalism have dropped as well. So, in other words, Americans are rethinking the old battle lines. But if we're being honest, most of us, and that includes me, have been using these words without really understanding what they meant. So, let's start with the dictionary. Merriam-Webster's defines socialism as a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. All right, that's the definition most of us grew up with. Again, that's one type of socialism. It's not the whole picture. The first, so that is state socialism. And that's the one that's haunted us for most of the 20th century. Under state socialism, the government owns all the means of production, owns the factories, owns the farms, owns the stores, owns the property. Every major economic decision is made by bureaucrats. You can't start your own business. There's no competition, no innovation, no entrepreneurial spirit. The government decides what's produced, how much, and what price. Everything runs by a central plan. So this was the system of the old Soviet Union. It was a system in communist China. It still exists today in North Korea and to some extent in Cuba. So this, again, I'm emphasizing, was the only kind of socialism that I saw, or that any adaptation of something socialistic would lead to. But there's another kind of socialism other than state socialism. It's called state capitalism. Now that might be confusing because it has the word capitalism in it. How can it be a form of socialism? And this is one that has confused me from the time that I was in China, and I may have told this story of the young lady that was our guide, and how within hours I had asked her about her views on Tibet, her views on Taiwan, her views on Tiananmen Square, and her views on their economic system. And later that day, my daughter said, "Well, Dad, you managed to violate everything. You shouldn't talk to a Chinese person about Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen Square within the first 2 hours." But I'm kind of a curious guy. But it was economically, she was telling me how she hated the taxes, and she took a lot of cash because she didn't want to pay an 8% tax rate, which was befuddling to me. That would seem to be very low, and she thought it was terribly high because she got nothing for that. And I said, I just don't quite understand the system here, and that you guys aren't capitalists. And she kind of looked at me and put her hands on her waist and said, I am a capitalist. And I just was like, how does communism and capitalism, how do they coexist? And I was not even aware of this until my recent research, that this is state capitalism. Okay, it looks like capitalism on the surface. There are private companies, there's stock markets, there's billionaires, but underneath, the government ultimately calls the shots. In state capitalism, the state either owns partial stakes in key industries or heavily controls them through subsidies, regulations, and political pressure. So the companies can be privately owned, but they only survive as long as they are aligned with the government's priorities. So this is what we see in China. This is what we see in Russia. The old Soviet-style state capitalism is gone in Russia, but we do see state capitalism, and we see it in Saudi Arabia. So the commonality is all of these nations are run by authoritarian leaders who decide which industries succeed and which fail. So if a CEO crosses the wrong person politically, they can lose their business or their freedom overnight. We've seen that in Hong Kong recently, where one of the billionaires, who is definitely a capitalist, has spoken out against the state capitalism and has been jailed. So again, while it looks at like capitalism from a distance, it functions a lot more like top-down control, state control. It's an economy that runs on fear, not freedom. The third type of socialism I'll call worker cooperatives. It can be confused. It's been called a socialist or a democratic socialism. But let's call it worker cooperatives, because I think that's a little more clear. In this worker cooperatives, businesses are owned and governed by the workers. They elect their boards, they share the profit, they make the decisions collectively. So this isn't state socialism. It's not a free-for-all. Worker co-ops compete in markets like any other business, but the power is distributed amongst those doing the work, not concentrated in distant locales, cities, with distant shareholders or bureaucrats. This model dates back for quite a while. It gained new life in the 50s, in fact 1954, when writers like Louis Kosser and Irving Howe proposed it as an alternative to Soviet-style socialism. And their insight was simple, but it was kind of profound, that the main task of democratic socialism, which is what they called it, is to prevent the concentration of power, in the hands of industrial management or a state bureaucracy. Just the opposite of state socialism. We see examples of this all around us, even though we don't call it socialism. Credit unions are the biggest one. They're member-owned cooperatives. We used to have insurance companies that were called mutuals, which are all member-owned. There's one cooperative in Spain called the Mondragon Corporation, with over 80,000 worker owners. It's thrived for decades. Food co-ops. I'm a member of a food co-op. Energy co-ops. We have energy co-ops in our area. Even ESOPs, that's employee stock ownership plans, follow in this tradition. So this form of socialism, which we're probably loath to call it that, is really about local control and community ownership. So the key here is democracy. It's democracy applied to the economics. Quite different from state socialism or state capitalism. Then there is what I will call a social democracy. Social democracy, again, the emphasis is on that word democracy. It's capitalism with a conscience. And this is the one that's made me stop to think and take a really hard, long look at my own assumptions. This is the model you see in Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, countries that embrace democracy and capitalism, but they have a strong social safety net. These are countries that I've called embracing socialism, and with the idea of the state socialism. Well, clearly they have markets, they have profits, they have billionaires, people that can have a chance of making money. It's just that they have a lot higher tax load because they use those taxes for a much larger safety net. The government doesn't run the economy. And the gap between the rich and poor is smaller in these countries. And the social contract, of course, is stronger. So we see things like universal health care, affordable college, strong unions, generous unemployment benefits, paid vacations. And these are all funded by high taxation, both on individuals and corporations. And I've written about this before, that the 40% tax bracket starts at around $9,000, $10,000 in most of these countries. So again, for most of my life, I called this socialism. But people in these countries don't call it socialism. They call it capitalism or compassionate capitalism. So this was kind of my first joint of humility. Admitting that I was wrong, that a social democracy is not the same as state socialism, has taken me months to get my arms around. And admitting that I've been wrong about my one-size-fits-all definition of socialism isn't just cognitive, it's an emotional readjustment. I had to confront the part of me that equated self-reliance and moral strength and capitalism with the idea that the biggest difference was the tax load. Now, I did a column not too long ago that the returns on countries that have state capitalism are about half of what they are in countries, say, like the U.S., that have a little bit more of a free market, but we are heading in the direction of state capitalism. But just going back to having to settle with the fact that a social democracy is still the underlying issue is freedom, capitalism, democracy. That is not tyranny. That that went against my money script that socialism equals tyranny. So state socialism does lead to tyranny, but social democracy doesn't. And I think that's really important. The important thing we need to look at under these systems is who holds the power. Under state socialism, the government owns everything outright. Under state capitalism, shareholders own it, but the government still calls the shots, deciding where plants are located, how profits are distributed, which industries get the breaks, get the subsidies, etc. And we've seen this recently with the intervention of the U.S. into NVIDIA, charging them 15% of their sales to access Chinese markets, with taking interests in Intel, etc. In a worker cooperative, the employees own the company. Totally opposite of these two systems. And under a social democracy, it's owned by the shareholders. But the labor laws, the taxation, create a system where workers have more support, and but the shots are still largely, let's say, they're shared with the corporation and the government taxation system. Okay, so which system is the best? Well, that really, I think the question is, where is the power? Because concentrated power, whether it's in government or corporations, tend to produce the same outcome, fewer people making decisions for everybody else. And we saw this play out in my hometown in Rapid City. I was put on a board by the mayor to take a look at adopting home rule in our town. And home rule gives more power to the locality, to the municipality, takes it away from the state. And shockingly to me, even though it was a bipartisan committee that unanimously agreed that there were no downsides to home rule, the city rose up against it. And it was during the time of the pandemic, and fears were running rampant at that time in our city that it was a bunch of liberals wanting to give more power to the city. And they told me flat out, we would rather the control be maintained with our state capital. So that said something about how we relate to power. Many of us are more comfortable with distant control, whether by government or big corporations, than we are with the shared responsibility. It's safer if things go wrong, where we can blame the distant people rather than ourselves. And we also need to take a look at some of the programs that I have labeled as socialist, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, which really aren't socialism. They don't involve the government owning production, not state socialism. They're social insurance programs operating inside a capitalist framework, much like a social democracy. And some of the things that we call capitalist are actually much closer to state capitalism. Again, take the 2008 financial crisis, when the U.S. government took ownership stakes in GM, Chrysler, AIG, or when it placed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac under government conservatorship. And they're still that way today. Most recently, the CHIPS Act has given billions in subsidies to tech and manufacturing companies with strings attached. Build factories here, pay workers this amount, meet these political goals. I've mentioned Intel, NVIDIA. This is not free market capitalism. That's the U.S. government acting a lot like the very systems we claim to oppose. And yet many of us, especially who see ourselves as staunch defenders of capitalism, accept all of this without question. So that contradiction tells me that our debate as a country around capitalism or socialism is not about economics. It's about identity, it's about fear, and it's even about not even understanding what we're disagreeing about. So that's what I had on my mind today. We need to ask ourselves, the next time someone's talking about socialism or even capitalism, which socialism are you talking about, or which capitalism are you talking about? The pure capitalism is free market capitalism. The controlled capitalism that's more like socialism is state capitalism. When we throw around socialism, are we talking about state socialism? Are we talking about a social democracy, which is a capitalistic system that believes in a strong social contract? And they're very different things. Quite frankly, the U.S. is heading down a path of state state capitalism or a social democracy. And the state capitalism is somewhat new. In the last 17 years, we've been trending toward that. So we need to be clear what we are talking about. Like so many disagreements that when I say one word, I can have one definition, another person can have another definition. We can have a huge fight about something, and we're not even on the same page as to what we are disagreeing about. So I don't know. Socialism and the definition may be too tangled to save. It's possibly, maybe it's been misused and weaponized beyond repair. But I think we can start the discussion in it. We can start the discussion first within ourselves. What do I really believe once I can give parts of myself some facts? We can maybe start having more informed discussions about it. And certainly those of us that are financial professionals, financial therapists, this can inform our discussions with our clients that are so often trapped in anxiety and fear without more information. And of course, we know that before we can get more information, we need to deal with the wounding, the emotional wounding underneath. So, again, maybe the real question here isn't whether you're a capitalist or a socialist. Maybe it's in what are my underlying belief systems? Where does the power live within a system? Inside me, inside my community, or in hands that are far from me? If we keep fighting over labels, we're going to miss the deeper truths. So, thanks for joining me, and I hope there's something that's challenged you in this monologue, something that maybe has been a discomfort, and maybe you too have some old beliefs about money, power, or even politics that deserve another look. And if you found this helpful, I am glad about that. Feel free to share the podcast with someone else. So take care, and thanks for listening.